Have you ever noticed how every market crash feels completely unpredictable until it happens, and then suddenly everyone claims they saw it coming? There's a reason for that disconnect, and it's not just hindsight bias. The truth is that the same warning signs have appeared before virtually every major crash in modern history. The 1929 collapse, the dot-com bust, the 2008 financial crisis. They all followed the same playbook. The problem isn't that the signs are hidden. The problem is that nobody wants to see them when times are good. I spend probably too much time digging through market history, looking for patterns that actually matter. If you want to understand what those warning signs are and how to spot them yourself, hit subscribe and stick around. Let's start with why even the smartest investors keep getting caught off guard. Let me paint you a picture of what it feels like right before a market crash. The economy is humming along nicely. Unemployment is low. Stock prices keep climbing. The news is filled with stories about people making fortunes, and the general consensus among experts is that we've entered a new era of prosperity. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This was the exact atmosphere in early 2008, just months before the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Most financial experts were still bullish. Housing prices had dipped slightly, sure, but the prevailing wisdom was that the fundamentals were strong. Here's the uncomfortable truth about market crashes. They never feel imminent when you're living through the build-up. That's not because the warning signs aren't there. It's because human psychology makes us remarkably good at ignoring information that contradicts our current reality. We anchor to recent experience. If the market has gone up for the past 5 years, we assume it will keep going up. If our neighbor just made a killing flipping houses, we assume there's still money to be made. The media doesn't help either. During boom times, optimistic stories get more clicks, more views, more engagement. Nobody wants to hear from the guy predicting doom when everyone else is getting rich. So the warnings get buried, and the cheerleading gets amplified. Think about the people buying houses in 2007. They weren't stupid. Many of them were following the advice of experts, doing what their friends and family were doing, making decisions that seemed completely rational at the time. The same was true for people buying tech stocks in 1999, convinced that the internet had fundamentally changed the rules of business valuation. There's a phrase that historians have identified as the 4 most dangerous words in investing. This time is different. Those words have preceded every major market collapse in modern history. The specifics change. Maybe it's new technology, or new financial instruments, or new monetary policy. But the underlying belief is always the same. The old rules no longer apply. And honestly, I get it. When you're making money, the last thing you want to hear is that it might all come crashing down. So we dismiss the warnings as fear-mongering. We convince ourselves that the people sounding alarms just don't understand the new paradigm. Here's the thing that changes everything. The pattern isn't hidden. It's ignored. The information that would help you see a crash coming is usually available to anyone paying attention. But paying attention requires acknowledging uncomfortable possibilities, and most people would rather not do that when their 401k balance keeps climbing. The good news is that once you know what to look for, these patterns become almost impossible to unsee. Here's what most people don't realize about market crashes. They don't happen in a vacuum. You don't wake up one morning to find that the economy has randomly decided to implode. There are always preconditions, a specific set of circumstances that create the fragility necessary for a collapse. The crash itself is just the moment when that fragility gets exposed. Now, I'm not talking about predicting exactly when a crash will happen. Anyone who claims they can do that is either lying or trying to sell you something. What I'm talking about is understanding the conditions that make crashes possible, even likely. There's a big difference between saying the market will crash on March 15th and saying the conditions that have preceded every major crash in history are currently present. The first claim is prophecy. The second is pattern recognition. Let me give you the 5 warning signs we're going to explore. First, excessive speculation in unproductive assets. Second, credit expansion that outpaces economic fundamentals. Third, concentration of risk throughout the financial system. Fourth, dismissal of people who sound warnings. And fifth, an external trigger that exposes all the accumulated fragility. Here's where this gets interesting. These 5 conditions have appeared before the 1929 crash, the 1987 crash, the dot-com bust in 2000, and the 2008 financial crisis. The specifics differ each time, but the underlying pattern is remarkably consistent. Let me repeat that because it's important. The pattern is remarkably consistent. If you look at the historical record, these warning signs don't appear suddenly. They build up over years, sometimes nearly a decade before the eventual collapse. The 2008 crisis didn't start in 2008. The foundations for it were laid throughout the early 2000s. As lending standards loosened, housing speculation intensified, and financial instruments became increasingly complex. The same was true before 1929. The speculative mania of the late 1920s didn't appear overnight. It developed gradually as more ordinary people entered the stock market, as margin lending made it possible to buy stocks with borrowed money, and as a general euphoria about American prosperity took hold. What makes these patterns valuable isn't that they tell you exactly when to sell. They tell you when to pay attention, when to be more cautious, when to question the prevailing optimism that always accompanies economic booms. Think of it like weather forecasting. A meteorologist can't tell you exactly when lightning will strike, but they can identify the conditions that make thunderstorms likely. Once you see those conditions, you behave differently. You don't go golfing in an open field. That's what understanding these crash patterns allows you to do with your financial decisions. You make adjustments based on probability, not certainty. Let's start with the first warning sign, and it's probably not what you expect. Warning sign number 1, excessive speculation in unproductive assets. This is when people start buying things not because those things generate value, but purely because they expect the price to keep going up. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but in the middle of a boom, this kind of speculation feels completely rational. Let's look at what this actually looked like before different crashes. In the late 1920s, ordinary Americans flooded into the stock market for the first time. Stock pools formed where groups of investors would artificially inflate prices and then sell to latecomers. But the real innovation was margin buying. By 1929, you could purchase stocks with just 10% down, borrowing the other 90%. Think about that for a moment. You could control $10,000 worth of stock with just $1,000 of your own money. When prices went up, you made a fortune. When prices went down, you lost everything and still owed money. Fast forward to the late 1990s, and the speculation looked different but felt the same. Dot-com companies with no revenue, no profits, and sometimes no actual business model were being valued at billions of dollars. Pets.com, a company that sold pet supplies online, went public in February 2000 with a market cap that briefly exceeded $300 million. 9 months later, it was bankrupt. Investors weren't buying based on fundamentals. They were buying because they believed someone else would pay even more tomorrow. Then came the mid-2000s housing boom. Suddenly, houses weren't homes anymore. They were investments. People were buying properties they had no intention of living in, sometimes multiple properties, convinced that prices would keep climbing indefinitely. How could you be left out when your neighbor was doing it? The common thread across all 3 periods is what economists call the greater fool theory. You don't need to believe an asset is actually worth its current price. You just need to believe you can sell it to someone else for more. And that works fine until you run out of greater fools. Warning sign number 2, credit expansion that outpaces economic fundamentals. This one is closely related to speculation, and they often feed each other. When credit is easy, speculation becomes easier. When speculation drives prices up, lenders feel comfortable extending even more credit. It's a feedback loop that feels great until it reverses. Before the 2008 crisis, this took the form of subprime mortgages. Banks were lending to people who had no realistic ability to repay, sometimes without even verifying income. The joke at the time was that you could get a mortgage if you had a pulse. That wasn't far from the truth. Historical data shows that debt-to-GDP ratios spike in the years before major crashes. This isn't coincidence. When an economy runs on borrowed money, it becomes fragile. Now, speculation and easy credit are dangerous on their own. But the third warning sign is what really accelerates the damage. Warning sign number 3. Concentration of risk throughout the financial system. This is when banks, investment firms, and other major institutions all become exposed to the same assets at the same time. It's the financial equivalent of putting all your eggs in one basket, except the basket belongs to everyone. In 2008, the concentrated risk was mortgage-backed securities. These were financial products created by bundling thousands of home loans together and selling pieces of them to investors. The idea was that diversification would reduce risk. What nobody adequately accounted for was what would happen if housing prices fell everywhere at once. Suddenly, banks across the country, and eventually around the world, discovered they were all holding variations of the same toxic asset. When the housing market turned, there was nowhere to hide. Before 1929, the concentration looked different but worked the same way. Investment trusts and banks had poured money into the same overvalued stocks. When the market started falling, everyone tried to sell at once, but there were no buyers because everyone was already in the same position. Here's the thing about concentrated risk. It feels like safety right up until the moment it becomes catastrophe. When all the major players are making the same bet, that bet starts to seem like common sense. If Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are all buying mortgage-backed securities, surely they must be safe, right? The institutional herd behavior creates a false sense of security. How could so many smart people be wrong? The answer, of course, is that smart people can absolutely be wrong when they're all working from the same flawed assumptions. And that brings us to warning sign number 4, the dismissal of people who sound warnings. Every major crash has its Cassandras, people who saw the problems building and tried to alert others. And every time, those people were ignored, dismissed, or actively mocked. Before the 2008 crash, Peter Schiff went on television repeatedly to warn that the housing market was unsustainable. He was literally laughed at by other commentators on air. Nouriel Roubini, an economics professor at NYU, earned the nickname Dr. Doom for his pessimistic forecasts. At the time, the label was meant as an insult. Go back to 1929 and Roger Babson warned in September that a crash was coming. He was widely criticized for causing unnecessary panic. A month later, the market collapsed. Here's what makes this warning sign particularly useful. The more aggressively warnings are dismissed, the closer the crash typically is. When skeptics are being mocked on television, when questioning the consensus seems almost socially unacceptable, that's often a sign that the end is near. Let me repeat that, because it matters. The absence of doubt in the public conversation isn't evidence that everything is fine. It's evidence that the market has become psychologically fragile. But the 5th warning sign is the one that tells you the crash is imminent. Warning sign number 5. An external trigger that exposes the accumulated fragility. This is the part that confuses people the most, because the trigger always seems like the cause of the crash. It's not. The trigger is just what reveals a system that was already broken. Think of it like a house with termite damage. The house might look fine from the outside. You can walk through it, live in it, have dinner parties in it. But the structural integrity is compromised. Then one day, a moderate storm comes through and the whole thing collapses. Was the storm the cause? In a sense, yes. But the real cause was the termites eating away at the foundation for years. The storm just exposed what was already there. In 2008, the trigger was the collapse of Lehman Brothers. But Lehman didn't create the subprime mortgage crisis. The toxic assets, the over-leveraged banks, the interconnected risks had been building for years. Lehman was just the storm that revealed the termite damage. Before the dot-com crash, the trigger was a series of earnings reports showing that internet companies weren't going to become profitable anytime soon. But the speculation and ridiculous valuations had been building for years. In 1929, the trigger was a combination of Federal Reserve tightening and growing recognition that stock prices had become untethered from earnings. Here's the key insight. You cannot predict what the trigger will be. Nobody in 2007 knew that Lehman Brothers specifically would be the domino that started the cascade. But you can recognize when a system has become fragile enough that almost any trigger could set off a collapse. Now let me bring all 5 warning signs together because this is important. Excessive speculation, easy credit, concentrated risk, dismissed warnings, and an unexpected trigger. These 5 conditions don't just appear before some crashes. They appear before virtually every major crash in modern history. Let me repeat that because it matters. This is not cherry-picking. The 1929 collapse had all 5. The dot-com bust had all 5. The 2008 financial crisis had all 5. When you study market history, the pattern becomes almost monotonous in its consistency. The specifics change. The assets being speculated on change. The financial instruments change. But the underlying structure remains remarkably stable. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's both empowering and slightly unsettling because it means you start looking at current market conditions through a different lens. You start asking questions that most people aren't asking. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You've got objections forming in your mind right now, and they're probably the same objections I had when I first started learning this material. So let's address them directly. The first objection I always hear is some version of, "This time is different." Maybe it's because of new technology or new monetary policy tools or new regulations that didn't exist before. And look, I understand the appeal. The specifics really are different each time. The 2008 crisis involved financial instruments that didn't exist in 1929. The dot-com bubble was about an entirely new industry. But here's the thing. Technology changes, financial instruments change, industries change. Human psychology doesn't. The greed that drives speculation today is the same greed that drove speculation in 1929. The fear of missing out that pushes people to buy overvalued assets is identical to the fear of missing out in 1999. The cognitive biases that make us dismiss warnings have been with us since humans first started trading. The "this time is different" argument fails because it focuses on surface details while ignoring underlying dynamics. Yes, mortgage-backed securities didn't exist in 1929. But the underlying dynamic of concentrated risk in poorly understood financial products, that existed. The packaging changes, the substance remains. The second objection is that you can't time the market, so what's the point? This is actually fair, but it misunderstands what I'm suggesting. I'm not telling you to sell everything when you see warning signs and buy back when the coast is clear. That strategy almost never works. What I am suggesting is that recognizing elevated risk should change your behavior at the margins. Maybe you don't go all in on speculative assets when multiple warning signs are flashing. Maybe you maintain a larger cash reserve. Maybe you pay down debt instead of leveraging up. These are adjustments to your risk posture, not attempts to time the market perfectly. The third objection is about false positives. What if the warning signs appear, but no crash comes? This definitely happens. Sometimes the system is more resilient than it appears. Sometimes intervention prevents the crash that would otherwise occur. But here's how I think about false positives. The cost of being cautious when warning signs appear is relatively low. You might miss some gains. The cost of ignoring warning signs when they're accurate is potentially devastating. You could lose years of accumulated wealth in months. The asymmetry of outcomes suggests that paying attention, even with some false positives, is the rational approach. The fourth objection is practical. Should I sell everything and hide under my mattress? No, absolutely not. The people who sold everything in March 2009 missed one of the greatest bull runs in history. Dramatic action based on fear usually backfires. The goal isn't to make you paranoid. It's to help you become a more informed participant in financial markets. Awareness changes behavior, but it should change it intelligently, not dramatically. So if you can't time the market perfectly, and you shouldn't panic sell, what's the actual point of knowing all this? Here's what understanding these patterns actually gives you: a fundamentally different relationship with financial news and market movements. When you know what to look for, you stop being a passive observer who gets blindsided by events. You become someone who asks better questions. Think about the psychological shift this creates. Most people experience market crashes as sudden, inexplicable disasters. One day everything is fine, the next day their retirement account is down 40%, and they have no framework for understanding what happened. They panic. They sell at the bottom. They swear off investing forever. Then, years later, they cautiously re-enter just in time for another crash. When you understand the warning signs, you experience the same events completely differently. A crash doesn't feel random anymore. You can look back and identify when speculation started getting excessive, when credit was expanding beyond fundamentals, when warnings were being dismissed. The event becomes comprehensible, which makes it far less psychologically devastating. But the benefits aren't just psychological. There are practical applications that can significantly impact your financial outcomes. Consider portfolio positioning. When multiple warning signs are present, you might choose to rebalance toward less volatile assets. Not selling everything, not trying to time the exact top. Just acknowledging that risk is elevated and positioning accordingly. The difference between having 20% in cash versus 5% might seem small during normal times. During a crash, that difference becomes enormous. Cash reserves become particularly valuable during downturns because crashes create opportunities. Warren Buffett famously advised being fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. The people who had cash available in late 2008 and early 2009 were able to buy quality assets at once-in-a-generation prices. Many of them became extremely wealthy as a result. Career decisions matter here too. When you can see economic fragility building, you might think twice about leaving a stable job for a risky startup. You might prioritize paying down debt over taking on new leverage. You might build a larger emergency fund. These aren't dramatic moves, but they compound into meaningful protection when the downturn arrives. Here's something else that changes: how you interpret expert opinions. Once you've studied market history, you start noticing when analysts are dismissing warning signs, when the consensus has become uniformly optimistic, when "this time is different" thinking has gone mainstream. These patterns become red flags rather than reassurances. The opportunity angle is worth emphasizing. Yes, recognizing warning signs can help you avoid losses, but it can also position you to capture extraordinary gains. The greatest wealth-building opportunities have occurred in the immediate aftermath of crashes. The investors who kept buying through 2008-2009 saw their portfolios multiply in the following decade. The beautiful part is that you don't need to become an economist or quit your job to trade full-time. So let's bring this all together. The 5 warning signs that appear before virtually every major economic crash are excessive speculation in unproductive assets, credit expansion beyond economic fundamentals, concentration of risk throughout the financial system, systematic dismissal of people-sounding warnings, and finally, an external trigger that exposes all the accumulated fragility. These aren't predictions, they're patterns, and they've repeated with remarkable consistency across nearly a century of market history. The 1929 crash had all 5. The dot-com bust had all 5. The 2008 financial crisis had all 5. The specifics change, but the underlying dynamics remain stubbornly consistent. This isn't about having a crystal ball. It's about recognizing that markets move in cycles, that human psychology drives those cycles, and that certain conditions reliably precede major downturns. Most people will never learn this, not because the information is hidden or requires an advanced degree, but because it's uncomfortable. It's much more pleasant to believe that this time really is different, that the experts have everything under control, that the good times will continue indefinitely. Looking for warning signs feels pessimistic, almost socially unacceptable when everyone around you is celebrating rising portfolio values. But here's what separates the people who build lasting wealth from the people who ride the roller coaster forever: the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, the discipline to maintain a long-term perspective when short-term thinking dominates, the understanding that crashes are not anomalies to be feared, but regular features of financial markets that can be anticipated and even exploited. Crashes are not if propositions. They're when propositions. The market will crash again. It always has, and there's no reason to believe it won't continue to do so. The only uncertainty is timing and severity. Given that reality, you have 2 choices. You can ignore the patterns and hope for the best, or you can develop awareness and position yourself accordingly. The people who understand these patterns don't avoid crashes. Nobody avoids crashes entirely unless they avoid markets entirely, which has its own costs over a lifetime. What they do is navigate crashes differently. They're less surprised, less panicked, and better positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that inevitably follow. Think about where you want to be when the next major downturn arrives. Do you want to be the person who had no idea it was coming, who sells at the bottom out of fear, who swears off investing for years? Or do you want to be the person who recognized the warning signs, maintained appropriate reserves, and had the clarity to buy when everyone else was running for the exits? The patterns are there. They've always been there. The only question is whether you're paying attention.